No, I didn't even realize that's what they were till I was looking at it earlier there, and I was like, oh, okay, is that what they are? Okay, welcome everyone. This is episode 28 of Tokyo Jazz Joints. 28, blimey. Who would have thought it? James, how are you today?
Feeling pretty good, man. How you doing over there in Dublin?
Well, I've got a little bit of a scratchy throat. Thanks for asking. I think it's nothing more serious than just a little bit of a sore throat, which is good. But yeah, don't be getting me too excited on this week's episode. I'm trying to save my voice.
I'm already getting excited about this week's episode because we're covering some great spots. Where are we going today? We are not in the Kansai again. We are back in Tokyo, right?
We're back in Tokyo, which I don't know about you, but it's a bit like when we do a Tokyo episode, I feel that same kind of sensation that when you arrive back at Narita Airport and it says welcome in English above the escalator as you go down. And there's something kind of oddly comforting about coming back to Tokyo and checking out some of the places that we have been to there. And I suppose part of that is maybe that a lot of the places that we went to in Tokyo, I guess, tended to be quite a piecemeal fashion. You know, some of the places that we've talked about in further flung regions tended to be more of a trip. It needed a bit more organization. Maybe we stayed overnight and so on. But I suppose Tokyo, we kind of picked them off a list, didn't we? One by one or a couple a night over a period of 3 or 4 years. So
yeah, and generally the pattern would be, the day before, 2 days before, sometimes even the same day when plans might have changed. It's like, hey, are you in town today? You got any time? Oh, I'll be near this station. Okay, great. Check the list. Let's go stop by that joint we were talking about the other day. I mean, sometimes it was just as piecemeal as that. And you were like, okay, I'll grab my camera. See you there in 2 hours.
Depending on the weather, of course. So the place we're going to start with a place today, which is also doubles up as a nickname I sometimes use for you in my head. Do you want to tell us where we're going today?
Oh, yeah. We are going to Big Boy in Jimbocho. And I'm not going to ask whether my nickname is Big Boy or Jimbo. Let's just leave it at that. Big Boy is an awesome little place. Do you remember the night that we went there? I think we had to wait outside a little bit. For some reason, the opening hours were strange. But when we went in, just a fantastic place. I had used to go there in the afternoons quite often when I was working nearby Jimbocho, which is an area of Tokyo, for those of you outside of Japan. It's sort of the old booksellers neighborhood of old Edo. So you've got hundreds and hundreds of small to medium-sized bookshops on the main streets and the side streets. So, of course, there's a lot of cafes as well where people will go after shopping to sit and read. But Big Boy is fairly new. It only opened about 15 years ago. Mr. Hayashi and his wife, absolutely wonderful couple. And when I was going through my notes about Big Boy Philip, I remembered he used to work in advertising before he opened the cafe bar. And he's the third guy that I've met who retired from the advertising world to open a jazz kisaten. And I was wondering if there was some sort of pattern going on there, maybe because of all the jazz they were using in their commercials or something, who knows. But it was Mr. Hayashi, Misho-san at Jazz Pub Misho in Shinjuku. We've talked about that before. And another place I don't know if you ever went to called Cafe Ellington in Asagaya. No. Maybe that closed before we started the project. Yeah, well, he was also an ad man, so it kind of struck me as a strange coincidence. But
we probably should say that, just to contextualize things, that it's not that Hayashi-san was way ahead of the game there with his mask, but obviously, if you're not more familiar with Japan, it's quite common to wear masks there for various reasons, usually to protect other people from your own cold or fever if you have one, and also, of course, from hay fever. So Japan, probably apart from doctors and nurses, probably Japan or Japanese people are the one group of people through this whole crisis that didn't really find it much of a big deal to be wearing masks. And I thought it was really interesting that even when I asked him to take his portrait that evening, he inadvertently created probably one of the more unique portraits from the project because, of course, he kept his mask on. And I always thought that was quite a strange decision. But
it's funny because I didn't even notice it. You know, I think when you live in Japan for so long, as you just mentioned, before COVID, it's completely normal to see people wearing masks, especially in the fall and winter. You don't even blink at it anymore. So when I was looking at the pictures getting ready for tonight's recording, it didn't even register to me, which is crazy. But I know for a lot of our listeners outside the country, they may think, oh, was this taken recently, But this was a good 4 or 5 years ago.
It's an interesting place, though, isn't it? Like, because it's an interesting place because it has an oddly clean or clinical feel about it. I think just even from the door and the lighting and the sign, it's very much like I've sort of referenced before, that kind of a little bit more like the jazz bar of the imagination. And one of the reasons it sticks out in my mind particularly is by far it was the most expensive cover charge we've paid. I think it was something like 950 yen just to sit down. And I remember it because obviously, as we've said in previous episodes, generally speaking, you get anything on a spectrum from birdseed to fairly decent peanut mix. But on this particular occasion, it was this beautiful, beautiful sort of mint and fresh peas, little sort of amuse-bouche that he had prepared. And of course, with your policy of not eating in jazz places, I managed, I think, to get both of them. And
you certainly did.
It cost me 18 euros, but it was very, very good. I have
no memory whatsoever of any mint peas, and I'm probably glad that I don't.
Trust me, it's seared in my memory. So this was definitely a standout for Big Boy for me.
Your picture of the outside door sort of gives an indication of why the charge in there is so much, because it's a really small room. You can see it's a sort of a corner of the building that somehow they've added a door to. It's amazing. It always strikes me in Japan, especially in urban Japan, the use of space architecturally. I mean, they will make a shop or an office out of the most random, oddly shaped spaces, and yet it works, But Big Boy is really small. I mean, I think maybe max 10 seated, and it doesn't really allow people to stand and drink. So he's probably got to keep the table charge high in order to cover the costs. And also, it does
also feel a little bit like one of those places, where perhaps the area or maybe this association that you've put in my head with advertising, where the kind of people maybe that are getting off work from companies or whatever are kind of highly paid enough that they're going in there and the last thing they're thinking about is the cost of the bill. I don't know. It just had a very, I just remember it being quite an expensive evening, I think, even just for a couple of drinks.
Well, you can see from the records, I mean, obviously he's got a record addiction, like all of the guys we talk about. But his sound system as well is absolutely spectacular, and he cranks it up. I feel like I'm repeating myself with every joint that we talk about, but not everywhere does play the music loud. But in Big Boy, as you can see, is very, very small. So if you're sitting there at the counter beneath that speaker, I mean, don't even think of having a conversation, let alone trying to read a book or something. I mean, you're there for the music. And I love that you got a picture of his Blue Note collection. I was trying to remember exactly what he told us about it. I do know that he is a completist. He's got the complete Blue Note collection of Blue Note Japan original reissues. So there's some gaps in the discography between what was released in Japan and in the US, but you'll often find a lot of the Japanese jazz kiseten are Blue Note collectors. But he's the only one that I've run into who had the complete version in the shop, and was obviously really proud of it because we talked about it for about 20 minutes. But yeah, Big Boy is a really great spot just because it's kind of no nonsense. He's really friendly. He and his wife are very welcoming. It is expensive, but it's definitely a place. I mean, I used to go for coffee and just sit there for 2 hours with one coffee, and listening to record after record. And yet again, in our long-running discussions of jazz joint bathrooms, I mean, what's going on in this picture, Philip?
It's like CD art meets Ikebana with a sort of I don't know, one of those taps they have on top of Japanese toilets just thrown into the mix there. It's interesting, isn't it? It's either deliberate, or there's a shelf above the picture that's fallen down and they just never got round to fixing it, albeit that the CDs have fallen in a beautiful arrangement. So I suspect that there's definitely the owner's hand in it.
It's definitely deliberate, and it's also because I have a similar photo somewhere on one of my old flip-top phones, but the CDs are different. So I think he actually
so it's
rotates. Yeah, I think he rotates them depending on what sort of vibe the monthly playlist is in. I should mention, if you are in Japan, the other really cool thing about Big Boy is that he plays a lot of contemporary jazz. I'd say he plays more contemporary jazz than most other jazz kiseten, including a lot of stuff from Europe. So yes, he's got the great Blue Note complete set and a lot of impulse, as you can see from the picture, but you're not going to just hear the same old 50s and 60s sort of albums that you may have heard over and over again in the jazz kiseten. You're going to hear a lot of contemporary stuff too, and that's really cool because I remember he played an album, I think it's Wolfgang Muspiel, the Austrian guitarist, who's was on ECM for a while, and he played one of his CDs. And on that system, I mean, it was just like hearing it in a completely new way. So I was really kind of happy about that. I've not been to that part of town for a while, but I know that he is still open. Definitely recommended it. Walk around Jimbocho during the afternoon, hit the bookshops. If you don't read Japanese, there's still a few that have a lot of English books too. And then you can pop into Big Boy. Definitely recommend it.
It seems like he's got some classical there behind him as well, so he's not averse to some classical. I noticed in the picture of him, actually, there's 2 or 3 albums behind him on CD.
What label is that? The yellow, I forget what it's called.
I know the one, yeah. And there's also like down the bottom left there, there's also Bach as well. So, yeah, I mean, obviously... which again doesn't surprise me. I mean, it seems like it would suit the kind of vibe of the place too. If you were going to play any other kind of music, classical seems to be the one. I should probably also just give a shout out at this point, actually. I know we normally wait till the end, but when I was showing some of the photographs in Rhinoceros in Berlin last year, I was introduced to a guy called Ludwig, who, strangely enough, Big Boy was one of his favorite places, which kind of, again, surprised me because it's not maybe one of the more well-known places. And his partner very kindly purchased a print, one of these prints from the Big Boy series for his birthday last year. So if he's been listening to the podcast, shout out to Ludwig and Clarissa in Berlin. And hopefully they're still able to get down to Rhinoceros when they can. So where are we going next then, James?
Okay, from Jimbocho, we are going to go over a little bit west to the neighborhood of Waseda. That's my old hanging ground. I attended Waseda University for about a year and a half in the early 2000s. Sadly, before this next place was opened. This is Jazz Cafe Nutty, opened in 2009. And not advertising people, but Mr. and Mrs. Aoki, who run the shop, they used to run a flower shop. And when I first went there to profile it for my jazz spot directory on TokyoJazzSite.com, they told me that they had run the flower shop for more than 20 years, and they were always playing jazz in there. Sounds like a familiar story. We know we've heard variants on this from other people, but they decided to take the plunge and sell their flower shop and open a jazz cafe. Now, I remember thinking when I talked to them, I don't know how profitable a really good flower store could be, but I imagine it would be a lot more profitable than a jazz cafe. So I know that they must have, taken a lot of their savings to invest in Nutty. And if you're looking at the pictures, you can see it's a very small room, extremely, extremely small. You enter in the door, which sort of just leads into a tiny little hallway. And then that's it. It's just about those 4 or 5 tables and then the counter kitchen with the records behind it. So you can only seat about 7 or 8 people in there. But as I said, the location is at Waseda by the university. So you've got a lot of jazz fan students who have time to come in every day for coffee, and people as well who just, wander around through the neighborhood. So they're still open 11 years later, which is just great news. It means they've been able to make it over the first couple hurdles. Now, I don't remember, Philip, when exactly did you go there? Because we didn't go there together.
No, this was one of those places that had been on our list for a long time, I think. And I suppose as we worked through our original list of places, more local ones we maybe tended to overlook slightly just because, you sort of think, oh, well, that's only around the corner or that's only a few stops away, so we'll get to that. So actually, I think I went to Nutty on my trip back to Japan that I've referenced before when we went down to Kyushu and up to Hokkaido, which we'll be talking about in the last series of episodes of the podcast. And I think it was the last day before I was to come back to Ireland that I went in, and I remember it because it was a really hot, and you can see from the exterior picture, one of those really hot Tokyo days where there sort of feels like there's no shade anywhere. And the cement's just like the concrete is just pumping out that heat, and you kind of feel like I need to get in somewhere. And I hung around, I think before he opened, because I was conscious of how small it was and knew, of course, that if I didn't get in there on my own, I probably wouldn't be able to photograph it. And as I sat there, sure enough, I think 20 minutes later, someone came in, and that would have probably stopped me from taking photos more freely. But having said that, like you said, it's not a massive place, and what you see in the photographs is pretty much what is there. There's a counter with a pretty extensive record collection, those beautiful speakers, and then 2 or 3 tables scattered around. The anti-smokers who are listening will notice that there is an ashtray in that picture there, and you can only imagine if that's filled with 4 or 5 people sitting at tables smoking and drinking coffee, what it's like as an experience if you're not a fan of smoking. But when I went there in the morning, it was, as I said, really clear. It's a fairly solid place, is the way you describe it. And you can see from there's got Mingus, got Monk, Eric Dolphy up there. But one thing that did catch my eye was the postcard of Kamasi Washington. Not completely stuck in the past by any means, but gorgeous little space. And again, like you say, imagine being able to go there rather than some sweaty, smelly student bar if you were studying.
Yeah, exactly. And you can tell from the picture that you took, the last picture in the series of the exterior with the bicycles. You see the door on the left next to it. That's actually somebody's, I don't know if it's an apartment or not, or like a 2-story apartment. But so they're sharing the building there. And I remember when the 3 or 4 times that I'd been to Nutty, again, they play really, really loud in there. Really, really loud. So unless Mr. and Mrs. Aoki are actually living next door to it, who's ever in that apartment is getting a whole lot of free jazz listening on their daily routine, which, I mean, if it was me, I'd be thrilled with that. But
I'd take it. I'd pay more for it if I could.
Yeah. But being a student area, it's interesting because we talked a lot before the history of jazz kiseten and how they were such an important gathering spot for students in the 1960s and 70s when Japan was, hyper politicized. Sadly, it's not like that anymore. Most university students are rather, how can we say, inactive with their political participation, and the jazz cafes don't really function with that role anymore. But I was very happy the last time I did stop by there, which would have been a good 6 years ago probably. I actually had to wait to get in because it was full of students. And that was just, it's only 7 or 8 people didn't fit in there, but still, I was really happy to know that at least some teenagers and kids in their early 20s were, digging the music and also digging the jazz kisa style, which doesn't appeal to everyone these days.
You can see as well there, James, if you are able to scroll in just to the right of Jazz Nutty there, it says, I think something along the lines of, listen to or listen with the musician's soul. It says musician no damashi o kikitore. How would we translate that for listeners that don't speak Japanese?
You would translate that as
kikitore?
Yeah, kikitore makes that sort of
have a listen. Would that work in English?
A little stronger. It's more of a command. It's more like listen hard, or shut up and listen is almost how I would translate that. It's definitely a command to sit down and take in deeply what you are about to be played.
Shut up and listen to musician's soul. Could be a strapline for a book when we finally publish one.
No, well, it's interesting though, because remember a lot of the kisuten, we've talked about that before, that they often have like maybe little coasters. In the old days, it was matchbooks. These days, it could be the meishi, or even their, on their website, they'll have little slogans, sometimes in Japanese, sometimes in English, sometimes in strange Japanese English. And that's not unusual. But to see it so sort of like directly in your face on the sign outside the shop, that one I've not seen before. But yeah, you would translate that as basically shut up and listen to the musicians who are bearing their soul for you. That's how I would translate that.
Yeah, if anyone wants to correct us, any Japanophiles or Japanese listeners want to correct us there, please feel free. We love feedback, whatever it is. So do get in touch with us. So that was nutty. We're staying in Tokyo, obviously, but we're moving to a slightly more down at home part of Tokyo, I suppose is the best way to describe it. And anyone who listened to the episode where we talked about Tokidoki, I suppose it's a similar kind of neighborhood, James, wouldn't you say? It's a similar kind of fairly residential, not so posh, not as fancy. Is that a fair description of where we're going next?
Yeah, I wouldn't call Kitasenju. I mean, the streets surrounding the station, sure, it heads out to its big residential neighborhoods, but it's actually very commercial when you come out of the station. But it's pretty far northeast. It's still in Tokyo proper, but it's way up in the northeast. Not an area that, I had spent much time in at all. And I remember when we'd heard about Birdland, it was interesting because, your first thought when you hear Birdland is that, it's a club, named after Birdland in New York. And when we got there, immediately I was like, oh, well, that must be a mistake. It's, it's clearly a cafe bar, but actually he's got live music there. I would say 3 times a week, sometimes more, sometimes less, but definitely a lot of live music. And interestingly enough, even though this is way out in the outskirts of Tokyo, he has a lot of foreign musicians come in. You remember we had a great chat about Candy in Chiba, a beautiful, beautiful Candy run by Hayashi-san, much farther out east. And she's hooked up to all this sort of Scandinavian free jazz groups who come to Japan and they play out there. At Birdland, it's not quite so much free jazz, but he's got a lot of foreign musicians who pop in, playing in either their own groups or in a mixed group with Japanese musicians. And it was really, really interesting because it's the last thing you would think when you look at the exterior. I mean, absolutely gorgeous entrance to Birdland, though, don't you think? I don't think there's another jazz cafe that has such a nice awning like that, an entryway with all the trees and the bushes.
And doesn't it have I think there was a couple of tables outside, isn't there, just as you come up in that front door?
Yes.
I think there's a little sort of almost like a veranda section where you could sit out as well, which I think again is not something that we necessarily would associate with a jazz kisa. It's generally indoors and, fairly dark and atmospheric. And so, I don't think we sat out there, but...
Well, no, that's the thing. Yeah, it has a very sort of tea salon kind of feel to it, I thought, and the sort of wooden interior, and this is just amazing. I mean, it's the only place we've ever been that's had Guinness on tap, which immediately I had to order one. But he also had Vedette, the Belgian sort of white wheat ale. Yeah, it's like a blue and white sign on the tap. He had that as well, and I was just like, wow, that's fantastic, So he's got great beer on tap. He's got live music. Morikawa-san, he was really friendly. Do you remember? Because he was about to close when we got there.
That's right.
So it's a very strict sort of delineation between cafe and bar time. I think it's like 5 o'clock.
That's right. Yeah, it was the sort of the limbo land between the two, right?
But he let us stay, and he talked to us for pretty much the whole hour while he was getting ready. And, he's got a lot of records in there. He actually lives upstairs. And unfortunately, the last time I went by, I think his health was a little poor. He's not that old from the picture, though.
He doesn't look it, yeah.
Yeah, but maybe he was just feeling a little under the weather that day. But you can see from the portrait that you got there where he's got his glasses low on his nose. I mean, he was just a real sweetheart. He talked to us for pretty much 90 minutes. Of course, he knew all the other kisaten that we had been, visiting, and he was well connected to places around town. But Birdland has got a really, one other thing. Of course, you got a great picture of it, the matchbooks.
Yeah, I was looking at those. I mean, again, it's super nerdy territory, but I suppose if you're listening to this podcast, you're already part of that crowd. So, why not just lean into it? But I mean, I think looking at some of those, I mean, we've talked about a fair few of those. The first thing, of course, that draws my eye with the matchbooks is top right-hand corner is Pithecanthropus erectus, which again, if you're a fan of the podcast, you'll know was where it all began. There's a place on there that we're going to be talking about in a moment. Of course, Stick as well, which we talked about before and sadly closed. And then down at the bottom there, Yamagata octet, again, fabulous. I mean, look at the design on the one at the bottom, which is Eagle, that piano player. I mean, you couldn't, I defy anyone to try and design that now. I mean, it's just so much of its time and of the era. You've obviously got Chigusa, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, and then of course, you know, Charmant as well, which is definitely one of our favorites. I know it's just, I mean, a gorgeous thing to have. I mean, imagine having those matchbooks. I know we've got a few of them from our travels, but like you said, they're not necessarily with the sort of perhaps the kind of heyday of jazz cafes waning, and also then people smoking less and less. I suppose they're not making them anymore. And I have been in places where they've almost apologized for either not having matches or not having business cards, because I guess there just isn't the need to have them or print them anymore. And it's kind of a shame, because we've seen this in a few places, but they're just, for anyone who's a design fan, I mean, they're just breathtaking. Some of the designs, they're beautiful.
This is getting well down a rabbit hole of jazz kisa dorkiness, but as you mentioned, we're on to episode 28. So if you're with us this far, you're probably going to continue on. But the one that you mentioned, of course, Pithecanthropus erectus, Chokuritsu engine in Japanese. It's got that nice sort of red kanji in the middle. But the one that struck me was the place that I don't know, and it's second from right at the bottom. Is it 300B?
Yeah.
Now that's
like that, doesn't it?
We've heard of pretty much every other place of all the matchbooks here in one way or another, either from people or from books or from seeing other matchbook collections online or in the jazz magazines. So most of these names are familiar to me one way or another. But this one, this one really left me feeling mystified, because 300B, if that's what the font says, and then there's that piece of white tape where the phone number must have changed, which was just sort of stuck on there and left, and then included into this picture frame. So I did a little research. I've not been able to find anything yet. So again, we do know that some of the listeners, some of you listeners out there are like us and have been to Japan or are in Japan and have been around to a lot of jazz kisaten and love it like we do. If anybody has information on this 300B, please let us know. As soon as we finish recording, I'm going to put out the jazz alarm call in Japanese as well. So maybe we can get some feedback that way. But I'm really intrigued about that one.
I'm just looking at, there's a 986 there. I was just looking for, you know, the calling codes. That's probably the best place to start. I've got one there for Kagoshima, so it might be Kagoshima or Miyazaki coming up as like 986, so it might be somewhere down there. I don't recognize that place on the right either, in Shibuya, this one that with the person dancing on a keyboard holding a coffee.
What is it called? Jazz...
I can't even read the
Isn't
font.
it digital? Jazz digital? Do you tell... I can't read that very well, actually.
Yeah.
But I've seen this before because of the guy dancing on the piano. I remembered that. And again, I mean, the design, it's just, look at, these are little matchbooks, and the design is just perfect. But yeah, no, I've seen this guy before, definitely. And also Roku, the Jazz and Coffee 69, I've seen that as well. A bunch of different places. So, but yeah, what a collection. I mean, I'm going to have to go back and ask him about that. Although I have a feeling that somebody gave this to him. I don't think these are his.
Yeah, possibly. We've seen it a few places, but I mean, again, it always makes me wonder, in addition to things like record collections, you know, what will happen to these things? I mean, they're just, certainly as far as we're concerned, completely priceless. You know, beautiful, beautiful things to have. And
he has a lot of things like that in all around the place, right?
I mean, it's just the stuff on the walls. I mean, when you look at the photograph of the speakers there, or the speaker, I think, you know, for me, again, that shelf immediately says to me Butsudan. So, you know, that's one of these shelves that a lot of Japanese houses have for like a little sort of household shrine. And again, you know, we see the speaker on there with various sort of music memorabilia rather than anything overtly religious. And then you've got these, you know, Matchbox cars, obviously jazz musicians, and just all sorts of stuff all over the place. I mean, it's just a fascinating place. And I think as well, for me, you know, what really stands out, you're talking about musicians coming there and playing. And again, look at the sign Birdland, where the beer sign Edelpils Birdland, and look how close the house opposite is. So, again, you're opening your window on the ground floor and, you're potentially going to be deafened by a jazz gig happening, within like literally a stone's throw from your front window. And I suppose it depends on your take on jazz and what type of jazz it is, how you'd feel about that. But it just shows that density of Tokyo and how claustrophobic it is.
Especially in that part of Tokyo, because this is the northeast part. It's known as Shitamachi. It was sort of a more working class area of old Edo. And the houses are so close together. Well, you can see in the background that red sign is a kind of a little drinkery, a little izakaya. And there's other shops as well on this sort of back alley interspersed with people's apartments. So it's quite amazing how everything is just so jumbled and on top of each other. But yeah, you're right. I mean, if you lived in that apartment right across the way, you'd have a free gig pretty much 3 nights a week, which again, I would never complain about that. But there's some people that might not dig it.
So to finish up this week for our third Tokyo Deep Cuts, I suppose based on the name, we probably should have started with this one rather than finish. But the final place we're going to go this week is called Intro. What do you remember about, well, you'd been there, I know, a few times, but I'll tell you what I remember is waiting about 45 minutes to get a drink.
Yes, but your photograph captured why we had to wait 45 minutes to get a drink. Jazz Spot Intro, absolutely wonderful. One of my favorite places in Tokyo. Again, pretty near Waseda University at Takadanobaba Station. So I used to go there quite often. It says coffee and jazz, but they don't really open for coffee anymore. The joint opened in 1975 by Moguchi-san, who is a real character, loves to talk. He's not always there anymore. The manager who runs the place, who I think, Philip, when you and I went, yes, that's right, because he's the guy playing saxophone in the picture, is Inoue-san. And as you got in your picture there, you can see him playing the saxophone while somebody's sitting at the bar looking over there. So basically, at night, he runs the joint by himself, but he also plays in the jam sessions. So Intro is a place where they've got jam sessions 4 nights a week. You can kind of see a little bit in the background. You can see the cymbals from the drum kit, right? And you see the piano in the background. So when you come in, if Moguchi-san's jamming with the band, you just got to wait until after he takes his solo, and then he runs back behind the bar and takes your order and pours your drink. Make sure everybody who's sitting in the joint has got their orders, filled, and then he'll run back, pick up his sax, and jump on in back with the band. So it's quite functional, if not a little bit slow. But man, I used to have some great nights there because, it was really, really interesting. There's not a lot of places. Jam sessions, and we've not talked too much about the live clubs here because we're focused on a different kind of jazz joint, but generally jam sessions in Japan are not like they are in, say, New York or in a lot of the rest of the world. They've got their own sort of system. The musicians have to pay to join them, which is very unpleasant for visiting musicians to Japan. But Intro is unique because it's basically in all levels. It's open to all levels. So you've got 18-year-old kids in the Waseda University Jazz Club coming in. And at 1 a.m, you might have a really famous professional Japanese guitarist or bassist or sax player walk in that everybody knows, and there's a big ruckus. And they'll all just play together. So, you might quibble about the quality of the music, but the vibe is just so warm and welcoming. The first time I popped in there, obviously, I was a young foreign guy, didn't really speak the language so well, and everybody was just like, oh, hey, you like jazz? Okay, sit down. And immediately it kind of felt like home. The last thing about it, and I'm sure we talked about this, was, do you remember the size of the piano? Okay, you've got to picture a little bit of...
oh, yes. That's it behind him, right?
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. So you in the first picture, you can kind of see the door, right? Jazz Entertainment Intro with the sort of metal door that swings in. Well, that metal door literally opens only at that sort of 45-degree angle, okay? And before it hits the bar. So for a long time, we were like, okay, they would have had to take the door down, obviously, but the steps that lead down to Intro, I mean, it's down on, I guess you would call it basement. It's not quite the second level basement, but 1.5 underground. It's absolutely impossible that they could have fit that piano down those steps. And so we've always been trying to figure out how they did it. It's a mystery. I've asked a lot of Japanese people about that as well. I asked musicians, it's like, how did they get this piano down here? Did they take it apart? Because it is virtually impossible that they could have lifted it down the steps.
Maybe it was always there. Maybe they just built the whole place around it.
Well, I mean,
they built the whole building around the piano. Who knows? I mean, I wouldn't, having been there, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, it's funny because in some ways, I suppose it's quite un-Japanese, and I suppose Corner Pocket, it was a similar kind of experience. You know, it's not the high level of efficient service that you expect in Japan. It was very much a lot freer, a lot more relaxed, and I suppose that shows you the effect that the music has had on the way people think that are involved in this kind of scene. Because, like you say, we sat there at the bar, the music was great, and then you kind of reach that point where you're like, do I just reach over the counter here and get myself something and settle up later, or is he going to be finished quite soon? And I think I feel like it was an afternoon. I had this feeling that maybe it was after work that I'd come across to meet you. And I know certainly that's obviously Takadanobaba is a university area. And I think a lot of university students will come in there, won't they? And use that opportunity. A lot of music students will come in, use that opportunity to jam and practice. And what a fantastic place to do it.
That is completely right. Well, we had gone to, I think, we had gone with your girlfriend at the time, now your wife. We had gone to Milestone, which is now sadly closed, which is also in Takadanobaba, where some miscommunication resulted at one point, leading to a little bit of unpleasant encounters with the owner there, but it was all settled out. I don't know if you remember that. Having to do with our delay in ordering. Do you remember when that happened?
No, what was that?
Oh, okay, so to diverge just a tiny bit. So we were in Milestone, and I think we sat down, and we didn't order right away, and then Sarah went to the bathroom. And while she was there, like, we kind of like didn't order, and then the owner came back, and he knew me, he had remembered me, but he didn't know you. And you said something like, oh, can't we just wait to order till she comes back? And he was just sort of like, please, like, you need to order now, like, you can't sit down here or something. And it led to a couple minutes of tension before we worked out that it was all miscommunication. I can't believe you don't remember that, because you were getting quite salty.
I'm sure the tension was nothing to do with me. I don't know what you're talking about. I'll tell you what I did forget was that Sarah was there. So I'm kind of glad in a way now that she doesn't listen to this podcast, because clearly for some reason, when you said my girlfriend there, I immediately chilled and thought, God, I'm going to have to edit that out just in case Sarah ever does listen. But it was her, of course. She just wasn't my wife at the time.
That's right.
So yes, I do remember now. And the three of us sat along that bar, and I desperately was trying to get a photograph of that saxophone, which I eventually did. But it was an amazing place. Again, I would say that's one of those places I regret not having been back to since, because it really is, from the jazz and entertainment sign that greets you, from the logo to the whole atmosphere, and just that experience of going in there and just taking in a jam session and then watching him run back to the bar to get a drink before he headed back to the band was definitely something unforgettable.
It's definitely unique, and that brings us back to our logo discussion from Nutty, because the intro website says in English, smoking, drinking, never thinking. And we used to have a picture of a guy smoking a cigarette. I think he's taken that down now, because, as we mentioned before, times are changing, and it'd be quite oppressive down there if you've got like 20 people chaining. But I remember, that's right, because it was you, me, and Sarah sitting there at the bar. It definitely took a while to get the drink, the music came on, and it was just a really mellowed out vibe. I think intro is one of those places. We were talking on the Kansai episode about Yamatoya, about how people mentioned it anytime you said you were going for jazz in Osaka. Intro is one of the 5 or 6 places that, when I started my own website, people immediately mentioned, because it has been around a long time. I mean, it's 45 years now. It opened in 75. And again, because famous musicians do drop by there, Moguchi-san, the owner, is sort of well known in the jazz community. He's always at the big Tokyo Jazz festivals. He's been in magazines. I think he's done a lot of, liner notes and sort of writing for the magazines. So, people immediately mentioned it. Like, oh, yeah, you got to go there if you like the retro vibe, and definitely lived up to it. And I absolutely love the sign picture that you captured there with, on the left side, the red one, which is a kushiyaki, kind of like fried snacks, little restaurant bar. And then the the Satsuma chicken on the right. It's just, I mean, again, look at this, man. Like, it's the same building, and this is just all, those three joints are just in the basement.
Yeah.
The entire building is full of places to eat and drink, which is just an only in Japan thing.
It's hopefully one of those places that will be more sustainable than some of the others, because I suppose if you've got that stream of young musicians coming there to practice, then with a bit of luck, maybe somebody will be inspired to take it over if the opportunity arises.
Well, I think Inoue-san, the sax player, is much younger than Moguchi-san. Moguchi-san's probably in his early 70s to mid 70s now. But Inoue-san is much younger, so I think that it's very likely he would take over ownership and keep it going.
Well, look, that was Tokyo Deep Cuts Part 3. We've got probably a couple more of those in the tank. And then we're going to move on to the sort of Tokyo Jazz Joints Redux, I call it, but it was 7 days in June, and we're going to take you through that journey day by day that we experienced 2 years ago now. Has it been that long? And
2 years, yes, that's right. Philip and I spending, what was it, 5 days, pretty much together every minute without killing each other.
So I'm not ready to talk about it yet.
Quite impressive.
I'm still dealing with a few things. But listen, if you, thanks everyone for listening. Obviously, as always, we really do appreciate your support. We've got a couple of things in the pipeline. One of which, of course, is if you're a regular podcast listener, is Patreon. You may be familiar with Patreon. It's a way of supporting podcasts. This is episode 28, and obviously we're doing this project and the podcast for the love of it, and for our own sanity as well during lockdown. But we calculated once when we sat down on the back of a receipt how much we'd probably spent on this project. And we reckon probably with mint peas, birdseed, Guinness on tap, petrol, train tickets, plane tickets, and everything else that's gone with this project, including, of course, building and sustaining the website and everything else. We reckon probably somewhere in the region of 10 grand we've spent of our own money. And we certainly did it for the love of it. But if you would be interested in supporting the project, we'd love to hear from you. And so I'll post a link to our Patreon page on our social media. Any amount is a good amount. So if you'd like to contribute even the price of a cup of coffee or a cup of green tea to the project, we would be more than happy to receive it. And of course, that will help us continue to pay for the running costs, for the podcast, for the website, and to keep the project going as long as we possibly can. You probably also know that somewhere in our future, we have a book of the project planned. And we're currently talking through a few ideas about that as well. Perhaps the idea of a Kickstarter campaign. So if anyone has any connections with any publishers, or indeed any experience with Kickstarter yourself, and you want to hit us up and give us some advice or tips that we can follow, we'd be more than happy to hear from you. So Tokyo Jazz Joints at gmail.com. You can get us by email, social media at Tokyo Jazz Joints, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And then, of course, the portfolio site, which I'm sure you're all familiar with by now, tokyojazzjoints.com. So there's really no excuse to not get in touch.
Couple of quick things to promote before we get out of here. You may have remembered last week I talked about the Village Vanguard in New York City. I was in touch with the owner, Deborah Gordon, again. They are going to continue doing their live streaming, so please do head over to the Village Vanguard website and check out some of the gigs that they're doing online Fridays and Saturday nights, East Coast time in the United States. Last week's episode, Philip, we discussed Our Man Swifty at Basie. The documentary is now out. I've not yet been to see it. There's a documentary made here in Japan about Sugawara-san and the wonderful jazz Kisten Basie. We discussed it a little bit. I've not seen it, but I did hear that it was very good. It was very enjoyable, if oddly edited. So you can imagine that the person who told me that was a very big film person. And last but not least, we've talked many times about the BBE label in England releasing the J-Jazz collections. If you really dig J-Jazz, head over to KOL Radio. That's the new online channel that I'm doing here in Japan with DJ Otsuka. We have a guest mix up from last week from Pascal in France, who is a big Japanese jazz collector, all original vinyl, and he's put together a sort of an introduction to the classic period of Japanese jazz. A couple tracks coincide with those BBE releases, but there's a lot more that's not on there. So if you're at all interested in Japanese jazz, please do check it out. Hopefully you haven't tuned out after that very long Patreon soliloquy. Philip, let's get out of here.
I think you need a separate podcast just for your promotions. Anyway, if anyone does donate to Patreon, that can be one of the rewards. They get a separate podcast episode of you just promoting your own things. Honestly, it's unbelievable. See you next week.
It's called creativity. See you next week, bud.
Bye.